Speak the charm of make. There
will come a time on the planet Earth when science and technology will be long forgotten. When wizards will rule the world.
This is the Arnemancy Podcast. Join your host, Reverend Eric, and his diverse array of amazing guests in an exploration of tarot, magic, the occult, and the history of Western esotericism. The Arnemancy Podcast exists thanks to the support of generous listeners like you. Please consider supporting this podcast for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Derek Hunter. Derek is an author of 15 books, 11 works of fiction, 4 of nonfiction. He's the creator of a philosophy called Love Chaos, an occult practitioner, and a general seeker after the varieties and depths of experience. 3 of Derek's most recent works are Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, Passionate Pilgrims, and The Human Drama Part 0, The Fool, Francine Fontaine. These were all released in late 2023 and early 2024. AAA, a novel. Maybe he calls it AAA. Do you call it AAA?
You can, sure.
All right.
Certainly, it's less of a mouthful than Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists.
Maybe it's just called Ah!
It is, right.
Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, a novel, and Passionate Pilgrims, a short nonfiction companion piece, were dedicated to the Shakespeare authorship question. The Human Drama series began this year with The Fool and will continue with The Magician on the Summer Solstice, a total of 78 short stories planned for the 78 tarot cards over the next 20 years. Welcome to the show, Derek. Thank you for taking time out of your 20-year life plan to be interviewed.
Thank you so much for having me here. You know, I appreciate it. I definitely like to stack up the years in terms of projects. That the Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist was a project 30 years in the making.
How do you maintain focus and interest in a project for that long? Like you just published The Human Drama Part 0.
Mm-hmm.
You have 21 more parts to publish. You have 77 more parts to publish.
Exactly.
And isn't there a part of you where it's just sort of like, okay, that's way too much. What have I bitten off? Like,
well, I think what helps me a lot is that having done 15 books prior to this, I've gotten a lot of the other stories out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So like in terms of ideas that may come up, it's like, well, I've already done a lot of these other ones. Like in terms of like maybe another idea for another novel or another nonfiction work, it's not really like interfering with the process of this. Now, in terms of in the past, like the Shakespeare project, while it was an idea that started 30 years ago when I was in high school, that was something that, you know, over the years, I abandoned it for sure a number of times and gave up on it a number of times. And I wrote various different outlines for it, probably a good anywhere between 100 to 200 different outlines with different authorship candidates as the lead character. So it changed and morphed over the decades. And as I went down that rabbit hole known as the Shakespeare authorship question, and so it was definitely not a fixed kind of static experience. It was like a lot of other books were being written along the way. My first 3 books, 2 novels and a short story collection, took a total of 12 years of writing. And so, you know, working on them off and on. And I think out of all the different stories I've done and ideas for books I've done, that's about maybe a quarter of all the different ideas, or probably even less, and 1/8 of all the ideas that I've had for books. So most of the ideas that I have, I just throw out the window. And even if I've already gotten a ways into them, it doesn't make sense to me to continue and see them to its end. And I just let them be. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. That's still an impressive amount of writing. I mean, congratulations. I'm really, I'm kind of envious, but also I know how much work it is just to do the writing part of a book. And that's not even all of the effort that it takes. So we're definitely going to talk about your Shakespeare authorship books, but I have some questions about the human drama series first. Okay, so the first one, the Fool, is also has a subtitle of a person's name, Francine Fontaine.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Are you? And I haven't read it yet, so I'm just sort of my questions might not make a whole lot of sense here, but are you sort of planning to have each card represented by a character?
Yes.
Then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And will the stories be connected somehow? Do you have a plan already for all of them?
Yes. Yeah. So the first 11 stories are going to take place in the modern day here in Los Angeles. So they'll be contemporary, kind of like urban stories. One of my favorite writers is James Joyce. And it definitely, he's been an enormous influence on me, a huge influence. And while for sure these stories will be very different from Dubliners, there's a lot that's in Dubliners, the short story collection that Joyce wrote, that definitely finds its way in these short stories. Definitely a very different kind of intent behind these short stories than what he did with Dubliners. But definitely, yeah, that's the plan, is the first 11. And then so the remaining 11 of the 22 major arcana will actually take place in the future. And so these are going to be set in the future. They'll be less specific to reality. They'll be more, so like there's a difference between James Joyce and Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett, a lot of times he sets his stories in unknown places. You don't know the place, you don't know the time. And I want to have these, they'll be science fiction stories, but they'll be kind of more ambiguous, more obscure in terms of the setting. The first 11 are going to be set very specifically in places. I've lived here in LA most of my life, so I know everywhere. So it's very much, a lot of references to things that are actually here. And then after the first 22 stories of the major arcana, then it'll go backwards in time. The remaining 56 short stories will take place in the past. And then it'll be a narrator that represents the suit. So there'll be a narrator that symbolizes the swords, and there'll be a narrator who symbolizes wands and so forth. And these will be actual historical people. So not again, referencing another writer that I like very much is the Portuguese poet Pessoa. So Pessoa, he created like these fictional authors that weren't him, that wrote these poems or his famous novel. And so that was something I wanted to do, was to have not fictional characters, but actual historical characters that are the narrators for all the stories that are contained within their suit. And then so I will explore the characters. I'll explore the suit and all the different cards through the characters. So that's the plan. Yeah.
That sounds ambitious and really fascinating. When you were talking about LA, and then you talked about going into the past, one of my first thoughts was like, oh man, Philip Marlowe detective story,
Sure.
wrapped up in tarot cards. That would be pretty cool. You can use that idea if you want to. I know that there's you've got a lot of cards to fill, and you might be like, oh crap, I ran out of ideas. What was that thing that Eric said?
Right. certainly that time period in LA of like the 20s, 30s, 40s is a very fascinating time here in this town. So definitely definitely not out of the question for me, for sure. Yeah.
I think it's sort of a period of time that is fascinating all along the West Coast, because it was when, sort of like modernity started to establish itself. People don't really realize like how close that is to, the time we call the Wild West, or like in Southern California, like the Spanish occupation or the Mexican occupation, like everything was changing.
Right. Los Angeles itself, like it was not that highly populated prior to like the 80s, really. Maybe the 70s is when you start seeing it as being a big city, but like, when you look at the eastern cities like New York or Philadelphia or Boston, Detroit, you just see they were definitely major cities at the turn of the century, the 1900s. And so, but that was not the case over here on the West Coast. We didn't really, the cities weren't.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There wasn't that many people. Now there's just got so many people over here now.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when you read like stories, like the Philip Marlowe detective stories and stuff that take place in Southern California, or like Grapes of Wrath and stuff. Like,
right.
You just get this vision of California as being vast swaths of countryside with nobody around,
right?
Because it was.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. That's absolutely what it was.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. I'm definitely gonna check those out. So I'll make sure that there's links to. So on your Love Chaos website, you have links to all of your books and all of your works.
Yeah, every single book is on there. I even have some music albums that I did years ago. All my past interviews, other things, explanations of the books, explanations of the philosophy of Love Chaos. Everything's on there. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, there will definitely be a link to that in the show notes. I'm really looking forward to checking out the human drama series. That sounds. It sounds like it. Especially since you were listing authors like James Joyce and Samuel Beckett. It sounds like it's probably going to be literary and complex. So,
I definitely want it to be like, because of the focal point for each of the stories will be on the character. It's the really want like, when as a reader, you certainly don't have to know anything about James Joyce or Samuel Beckett or Pessoa or any of these people to get into the story. Like the main sort of emphasis is this person. Like, who is this person? What's their deal? And then beyond that, their story is then their connection as well. Why this person connected to the tarot card, that specific tarot card. So that's like kind of the main emphasis for these tales.
Do you think people reading the stories who aren't familiar with tarot will be able to get as much out of it, or do you anticipate that it will inspire those sorts of readers to learn more about tarot? How is it? How deeply is it connected to tarot in terms of like audiences' understanding?
I definitely want it to be something where if you don't know anything about the tarot, you could still enjoy the story. I very much want it to be like an entertaining story for sure, just following this character, this person, and what their journey is. But definitely, it definitely has lots of these stories have lots of references to the specific card that it's related to, but it's not necessary for the reader to know those references in order to enjoy the story. It's very much more about who this person. And but definitely I'm hoping that it will introduce people to the tarot. So what I do on social media, on my the Love Chaos Facebook group, is also on Instagram as well, is I do these posts sort of explaining these different cards and these different decks that I have. So I have the Crowley Harris Thoth deck. I have the new Austin Osman Spare deck that just arrived, and the Marseille deck, the Smith-Waite deck, and also to the Solabusca Tarocchi as well. And in the Leonora Carrington, she just did the Major Arcana. So my plan is, like, as I write these posts on social media, I'm going to collect them as nonfiction companions. So each year there will be like year one, which will have the first 4 stories. And along with the stories, it'll have these nonfiction sort of investigations in terms of the tarot, my personal take on each of the cards and the different decks. So that way it'll be kind of like, for those who maybe don't know anything about the tarot, it'll be another avenue to understand the tarot. And also too, for those who do know it, just to kind of enjoy it and get something a bit more out of it too, as well. Definitely, it's not necessary to read these short fiction, these little pieces I write on social media to understand the story, but it just allows the reader to get a little bit more deeper into the tarot.
All right, that sounds really fun. I'm definitely going to spend some time this summer reading The Fool.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, they're not too long.
It sounds like a good adventure.
They are short stories, so that it helps for people we're all so busy. So it's nice that they're just short little pieces.
Now, before we get into the Shakespeare topic, I just really want to get the elevator pitch for Love Chaos. What is Love Chaos? How would you explain it to somebody very quickly? Like, hopefully we can do that quickly and still have time to talk about Shakespeare, hopefully.
I'll do the elevator pitch. Well, the first thing is that it saved my life. So it saved my life at a time where it was extremely difficult in 2014. So it's now 10 years old. And from that point on, I have written 3 books on it. It's the premise of the philosophy is that it views the universe existence as inherently unpredictable and chaotic in nature, and so that within that chaotic framework that we find ourselves in is to emphasize our attention, our thoughts, our feelings, our energies on love, loving other people, loving ourselves, loving existence itself, and that's the basic underlying premise. And there's different steps that people can take, but that's the underlying premise behind Love Chaos.
Are you familiar with the concept of Eros as sort of a cosmic binding agent from like Renaissance magic?
So yeah, I mean, I think that it's something that is relatable to Love Chaos for sure. I think that in terms of what was going on in the Renaissance, there's just so much going on back then, whether it be in Italy or in England or elsewhere on the continent, for sure. I definitely think that in terms of Love Chaos, it's very much an open philosophy, and so it allows people of various different practices and religious beliefs to incorporate it in your own life. Like someone could be a Christian, and someone could be a Satanist, and someone could be an atheist, or someone could be like me, an agnostic, and be able to practice Love Chaos. So it allows people to use various different practices along with it. It doesn't take the place of one over another. Okay, that makes sense. I like that. That was a really excellent elevator pitch. You definitely. It sounds like the sort of thing that probably deserves its own conversation, but instead, I really want to get into your Shakespeare stuff. So you had 2 recent works about it, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists and Passionate Pilgrims. Can you sort of tell us, like the Shakespeare authorship question, it's usually sort of considered almost a like pseudo-history, conspiracy theory sort of topic. At least I think so. Like I haven't read about it or looked into it for a very long time. Can you kind of tell us the, I don't know, state of the topic? Like what's up with old Shakespeare, with old Bill the Bard? Well, so just coming at it from the personal experience, I first fell in love with Shakespeare back when I was in high school, like at the age of 14. I had a great English teacher who was just made Shakespeare electric and alive and vibrant, and first got into the stories. So then by getting into the stories, it allowed me anyway, to just really get into the language and the characterization and the themes behind the plays and the poetry. So that's where it got me. I got hooked, and I've been hooked ever since. I've been obsessed with Shakespeare. I've read all the plays. I've listened to countless radio productions, seen countless films, and just seen in countless stage productions. And just it's definitely been one of the biggest obsessions of my life. So there's a lot regarding Shakespeare that I'm absolutely in love with.
Have you ever been up to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland?
In Ashland, yes, yeah. When I was in Seattle in the early '90s, I organized. I was so excited about Shakespeare back then. I organized myself and 12 other students from my school, a really awesome school, by the way, in Seattle called Nova, that was modeled off after A.S. Neal's school in England, Summerhill, where it gives students enormous freedom, and is Summerhill is definitely an absolutely fascinating study and education. And so the school in Seattle, Nova, which is still around, was enormously influential in my formative years, my first 3 years of high school. And I fell in love with so many different things there. But I took some students some of my fellow students. I mean, we drove in the van I had at the time. We all drove down to Ashland and had an amazing time. It was a wonderful experience. It was absolutely beautiful there. I loved it.
Yeah, I went to college in Ashland and took classes on Shakespeare, and I grew up in Southern Oregon, so I have been to OSF dozens of times and seen lots of plays too. I also am a very, very big fan of Shakespeare, and somewhere behind me on one of those shelves, either currently is or used to be like a whole row of like those little black and white paperback Shakespeare plays. I think I have a collected edition somewhere now, though. I think I got rid of all the paperbacks.
Those individual ones from Penguin are great. They're really
yeah, the Penguin ones.
I love those. Yeah, but I remember. Yeah, and I don't remember which interview I heard you speak about your experiences in Ashland and just how much you like it there. And I just remember that time I was there, and I loved it too. It's a beautiful town, and it's just so great to be there.
Yeah.
If you love Shakespeare and you happen to be around there at the time they're doing it, it's something you got to go there and do it. Oh,
for sure. I honestly think anybody who can make it to Ashland in one day of driving should go there for Shakespeare. Like get there, watch some Shakespeare, spend the night, maybe watch another Shakespeare, and then drive home.
One of the things is I just want to say really quickly too, because my novel, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist, there's a lot of characters that people are less familiar with. One of them is John Fletcher, and he's not necessarily one of my favorite of the crew, but there's a really excellent production from the 50s from Ashland Shakespeare Festival of one of his plays, and it's so hard to find productions of these other playwrights, whether it be Fletcher or Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, of course, is more well known.
Right. Yeah, I was going to mention like Marlowe is like the only one that I think I've even seen hints of, and probably only because he did
Dr. Faustus.
Dr. Faustus.
But then also Ben Jonson. I would say Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe, the two most well known outside of Shakespeare at the time. But there's a lot. There was just so much going on back then, and but in regards to your question though about the Shakespeare authorship question, so what happened was that here I was this teenager, and then the following year, my sophomore year, I had to write a biography about Shakespeare. So by this time, by my sophomore year, I had fallen in love with James Joyce. I'd fallen in love with Arthur Rimbaud, the French poet, fallen in love with Dostoevsky, and I was just getting into them. But one of the things
you are such a nerd.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm still absolutely a literary nerd. I love it, and but so one of the things that I loved about those three authors in particular, and I was just getting into them. I loved this at the time, and even bands too. Like I was into Nine Inch Nails, so and The Cure, so I wanted to know about Robert Smith.
Ministry. Probably.
Yeah, Ministry, yeah, definitely, and Skinny Puppy for sure.
Oh yeah.
And I was like a goth kid in Seattle when everyone was into grunge. It was actually at the time of grunge, the early 90s, and so.
Oh yeah, do you remember how exhausting grunge was? Like every single song sounded the same.
Yeah, and
it was just like every single band was just unwashed dudes with flannel shirts and like a chip on their shoulder.
Yeah.
Whiny, so whiny.
It was it wasn't. Yeah, I mean Nirvana is really the only one that kind of holds up for me today, but outside of them,
I suspect we're the exact same age. It sounds like we had the exact same experience.
Yeah, 46. So I'll be 47 this year.
Yeah,
so
I'm 48. So we had the same experience.
Absolutely. So it was. So I was tasked with writing this biography. So here I was, this teenager who was like not only in love with the works themselves, but the people. So I loved knowing about James Joyce's life. Like to me, his life was just absolutely fascinating. The journey he took, his experiences growing up in Ireland, and then his decision to like leave Ireland and take his wife with him, and they had kids, and he lived on the continent for the rest of his life. And just his own personal journey was just fascinating to me. And Dostoevsky, another fascinating person, and then Arthur Rimbaud, another. So I get to Shakespeare, this man from Stratford, and everything that we have information about him. And a lot of times biographers, they say that we don't really know much about him because of the times. Actually, if you investigate the times and if you investigate Shakespeare, there's actually quite a lot known. We know quite a bit about Shakespeare, But everything that we do know is just absolutely not interesting. It's just a lot of just very boring. It's either really boring business transactions or evidence of a man who was extremely greedy and very just like ruthless over really small stuff. He refused to pay taxes. He went after other people, sued other people for like really small amounts of money. And then when there was a famine in his town of Stratford, he hoarded grain. Like there were some people, business people that practiced it, but there was a lot of other people who were generous, and if they had something, then they shared it with people who were starving. Shakespeare was not. He was not one of those people.
So he might have just been a real jerk.
Well, he was that for sure. But then, in addition to being a jerk like that, I think being a jerk in and of itself definitely doesn't negate someone from being an artist, a creative person. Mm-hmm. Not at all. Like a lot of creative people have been complete assholes. I think I think the problem that I had with Shakespeare, that there's nothing to show of an artistic life, and this contrasted starkly with other writers at the time. So if you look at other writers who are a lot less investigated, a lot less researched, there's way more that we have about them in terms of them writing about each other, writing, like introductory pieces for their friends' piece, or just like there just was like this. There's a lot of just vibrant energy at the time, and that didn't show up in Shakespeare's biography. So for me, it was just very disheartening, and it was very. I was just not satisfied. And then I came across this thing called the Shakespeare authorship question. And so this was something that I realized it had been going on for quite a while. And there was a lot of prominent thinkers who doubted Shakespeare's authorship, whether it was Sigmund Freud or Mark Twain or Walt Whitman or Orson Welles. There's a long list of people who didn't think Shakespeare was the true author.
Uh-huh.
And what I found, so the Shakespeare authorship question is generally considered to have started in the mid 1800s, and it was Francis Bacon was the first sort of like alternative authorship candidate that was proposed. So for most of the 19th century, everyone sort of rallied around Francis Bacon. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that if you look at the times, there was definitely people who were kind of like questioning the authorship at the time. There was these two poets, John Marston and Joseph Hall. One was arguing for romantic poetry, and the other one was arguing against it. And they used the two narrative poems that were published with Shakespeare's name on them as an example of romantic poetry, and which was Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. And so I forget which one was the proponent for it and which one was against it. I think Marston was against it. I'm pretty sure Marston was the one against it and Hall was for it. But or it could be the other way. I'm not sure. But they were arguing back and forth, and they both made reference to that the author of both those works was using another man's name in order to not take credit for. Well, the guy who hates romantic poetry was saying in order to not take credit for such horrible filth, right? Because it was very sexy. It was very like racy. It was a lot of like sexual innuendo in there in both those works. So, and then they also, and this is where a lot of Baconians will say that it's Francis Bacon, but by the end of it, they both make reference to the Bacon family motto, which is mediocre firma, which I believe it proceed in moderation, which was their father. So Francis and his older brother Anthony Bacon, their father Nicholas Bacon, that was their family motto for their family crest. And so there was already people doubting Shakespeare authorship at the time. And this was in the 1590s, so the same decade that you first see Shakespeare. But it didn't really become like a thing until the mid 1800s. And then it just took off from there. Mark Twain was like a big believer that Shakespeare was not the true author. Then other people, then other alternative candidates, William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, and then the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, and he became like the biggest alternative authorship candidate. You had Christopher Marlowe being a big authorship candidate. And then just over the years, you've just had a lot of different theories, like hundreds of different theories. If you go on Wikipedia, they have a list of 80 alternative authorship candidates that have been proposed over the years. Just so many. And so for me, it was just a matter of just like going through and I read a lot of books, watched a lot of documentaries, got into a lot of debates with people in person and online. And it was definitely a long process. And it wasn't easy because like every theory has some validity to it, and also some things that are I find to be faulty. I think that it was difficult, definitely difficult journey, but it was a very rewarding journey as well.
Do you think that there is any way, given the existing evidence, that the Shakespeare authorship question can actually be answered?
I think we're at the closest we've ever been. There's this, and there's this one guy. His name is Dennis McCarthy, and he has this theory that the guy who wrote them was his name was Thomas North. For the last 15 years, he's dedicated his life to proving that it was Thomas North, and his theory is that there was no conspiracy involved. There was nothing like no hiding or anything like that. It was just that Thomas North wrote the original plays, and then Shakespeare just simply took these old plays and adapted them, maybe did some revisions, but very minor, and put his name on them. And he has a point, because even the first few plays that were printed in the 1590s, they do actually say newly revised, adapted. And so they're even on the printed page, they're saying that it was revised and adapted by William Shakespeare.
And that sort of process of revising and adapting earlier works was actually fairly common.
Yes.
Like, we have lots of works from the 1500s that were just like, barely repackaged earlier works. Printing was still pretty new then.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Dennis it's definitely worth checking him out. Go on his website. He wrote a book. He's written a few books, actually. There was a book written about him by a journalist by the name of Michael Blanding, which is called North by Shakespeare. And that actually got quite a bit of attention back in 2022, I think it was. 2021. No, 2021 is when the hardback came out. And then Michael Blanding released the paperback in 2022. And they changed the title. The publisher changed the title, I'm not sure, to In Shakespeare's Shadow. But if you look up both of their names up, Michael Blanding is the journalist, and then Dennis McCarthy is the guy who basically. So, and what he's done is he's come up with tons of evidence, that more so than I've ever come across. I've never seen anybody come up with as much evidence as he has. And what he's done is he's used computer software, plagiarism software techniques, basically the same technique that was used to identify the Unabomber in the 90s, was that we writers, we write a certain way, and we have certain ways of not only choosing certain words more than others, but also word pairings. So you'll have certain like a string of words that are all very closely connected to each other. And then a lot of times expressing very similar ideas or the exact same ideas. So one of the things you'll see when you go on Dennis's website is he'll show you. So Thomas North, so for people should know who he was. Thomas North was a translator. So he was known mostly for translating Plutarch's Lives in 1580. And then there was some additions that came later. But so Plutarch's Lives was originally written in Latin. It was a Roman. Plutarch was like a historian, and then there was a French translation by forgive me if I'm not pronouncing right, Amyot, Amyot, and his translation was very popular in the 1500s. That's one of the French philosopher Montaigne. That's one of his favorite books, was Amyot's translation of Plutarch's Lives. And so North was a translator of that book, and he also wrote translations for other books when he was younger and later, The Moral Philosophy of Doni and The Dial of Princes. And then his last work in 1602 was Nepo's Lives. So he has these 4 translations with his name attached to them. But what Dennis has basically done is shown that Thomas North was a playwright as well. but he came so much earlier than Shakespeare at a time when playwrights didn't put their names onto plays. You didn't want your name associated with plays, with the theater. He was a member of the Elizabeth's court. He was even older too. He was actually there during Queen Mary's court, and wrote plays during her time. And Dennis he's shown a great deal. You know, people have tried to disprove his findings, but it's so hard to. It's hard to say that Thomas North didn't have some kind of hand involved in it. Now, the problem I think where people can come up with, and this is where I had a problem with Dennis's theory, is that if you look at Thomas North's translations, they are brilliant, they're excellent, and they're highly praised. They have been highly praised for centuries. But there's a big jump between those translations and the plays and poetry themselves. And that's where I had the problem with Dennis's theory. So I really, truly believe that Thomas North was like the biggest author of the Shakespeare canon, but that he had tremendous help from others, which was the norm back then. So you would have, in those days, you would have one person who was called the plotter. So the person who wrote the storyline, the plots, and then they would have at least one other author help them write the scenes. In some cases,
we do that now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, one of the things we have to look at is like, what was the mindset of these people writing the plays? Like, they weren't like sitting down to make a masterpiece for themselves. They were churning out plays for like popular consumption. Like, that's exactly how, you know, like Babysitter Club books are written and romance novels are written. Like, somebody makes the outline, somebody else fills it in.
So what we think people have to understand is that historically, like if you look back at those times, Queen Elizabeth wanted to get support for her Protestant religion because a lot of their aristocracy, the nobility, were still Catholic. So she had to find support. And so what she decided was that, let me educate my people. And by educating her people, she could get support for her agenda. So at this time, you see these public schools, basically, for people who are either middle class or the lower classes, having these avenues of education. So you had like the two biggest schools that were in London were Westminster, which is where Ben Jonson went to, but also there was another school, the Merchant Taylors School, where the other playwright Thomas Kidd went there. Also Edmund Spenser went there, Thomas Lodge. So there are these guys who are coming, like Ben Jonson, his father was a bricklayer. Christopher Marlowe's father was a cobbler, which is a shoemaker. And so you have these guys coming from the lower income part of the society being offered this education. And so they go into these schools, and then from there most of them would go to universities. A lot of them would drop out of university. But the problem was, so there's all this educated young men who were super smart and super witty, and it was really the birth of early modern English. And there wasn't really enough jobs for them. There wasn't, like, you only had so many jobs in religion or in the law or in medicine. There wasn't a lot of jobs for these kinds of guys who were educated. So this happened at the same time when you had the public theaters open up in the late 1570s. And so then by the 1580s, there's this explosion of this popularity of public theaters. And then it just kept growing, the 1590s, the 1600s, and into King James' reign. You just have this huge demand for plays. And so a lot of these guys turned to writing plays to make a living. So this was like a job to them. But it was more than just a job. It was also an avenue for their artistic expression too. So there was the demands of what was popular. But a lot of them also saw themselves as being important artists, in their own right. Like it wasn't like they were only doing it for commercial reasons. They saw themselves in these really high. They just saw themselves in a high fashion, in a very stylized fashion, and they were just really getting by with it. But they enjoyed it. They loved writing these plays. A lot of times they hated each other. They loved each other. There was just a lot of jealousy, a lot of competition. There was a lot of writers that have been completely forgotten. There's a lot of people who were probably just completely forgotten that were writing plays during those days. There was thousands of plays being written at the time. So with this high demand for plays, they had to turn them out quickly. So one way to do it quickly was to have people working on the play at the same time, writing scenes, so they could get these plays out within a few days.
Yeah, and honestly, it reminds me of like some other parallels at the time, like paintings were done that way too.
Yes,
Especially like those massive, huge portraits, like Rembrandt's huge portraits, like the Night Watch and stuff. He didn't paint all of that. He had like a whole army of painters. He would like do outlines and maybe paint some faces and be like, okay, put everybody in a blue uniform or whatever. Like, yeah, I mean, the message being that we ascribe authorship or creatorship to one person when it's really like a team or a group that are putting these things together, especially since, these weren't seen as high literary items. It wasn't like the lone struggling author, chewing on his pencil and starving in Oslo. It was like a team of people putting together a production for publishing and entertainment and making a living and putting food on the table.
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
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 So Thomas North, we should give people a little bit more context. Like he was born in the 1520s, 1530s.
Yeah.
And he died in 1604.
Yeah. So he was born in 1535.
Uh-huh.
And so his father, Edward North, was a kind of like really made a big name for himself under Henry VIII's reign. And it was one of the very few people who kind of like survived Henry VIII's reign and thrived. He was an enormous survivor. And probably just extremely lucky too. So he really turned the North family into this prestigious thing. And so they had a lot of money. They have this big thing. He owned a lot of property and just was a very successful businessman and a political player too, very successful political player. Thomas North was the second born son. So being the second born son, you're really in this position where there's a lot less available to you in terms of what you're going to do with that big family title. So his older brother kind of inherited everything, and Thomas North he got involved in the law. He got into the theater world. We know for sure he was writing plays during Mary's reign, Queen Elizabeth's reign. There's references to him being a playwright. So we know he was involved in plays. And so his brother paid him for plays. The Earl of Leicester, who was Queen Elizabeth's like favorite off again lover, probably. He was basically Leicester was really close friends with Thomas North's brother, Roger North, and so Thomas North found himself in that circle at court. He was banished along with Edmund Spencer in 1580 to Ireland and to fight in a war over there. And Edmund Spencer ended up staying for pretty much for most of the rest of his life in Ireland, whereas Thomas North came back to England in the 1580s. And we know that there's a highly good chance, because he was basically banished by his family and the court, that he got back into writing plays again, but this time for the public theaters, which are a big explosion in the 1580s. There's references to a Sir Thomas North, and we don't know of any other Sir Thomas North as late as 1607. So we don't know for we don't know for sure when he exactly died. There's no record of his death. So, and that was
he would have been pretty old in 1607, though. He would have been like 82.
So 72-ish. Yeah. So that definitely was rare in those days, but it was not by all means like unheard of. You had of course John Dee. He lived into his 80s, and then you had William Stanley, the Sixth Earl of Derby. He lived until his 80s. But for the most part, you didn't see. There was another guy who was also a playwright in the same age as Thomas North, Thomas Sackville, and he wrote a play with another author, Thomas Norton, called Garbuduck. And Garbuduck is one of the first examples of English blank verse.
Oh.
And so a lot of times people who don't know that much, they think that it was like Christopher Marlowe who like invented blank verse, but that's not true whatsoever. So it was definitely it was published in 1563, and Thomas Sackville, who was a member of the court in Queen Elizabeth's court and a major political player, was furious that the play was published and had his name being put on it. it's important to know that for people who were, especially people who were in political power of the court, you did not want your name associated with plays. And so even with poetry, poetry, there was a poet at that time, Edward Dyer, and he never published any of his poetry, but there's all these references to other people, his peers, saying, how great of a poet he was, and also Thomas Sackville. But there's just, Thomas Sackville, there's a couple of things we know that was written by him. But for the most part, it was all done very privately and discreetly. You didn't want your name out there saying you were a poet or a playwright, especially. Right. But Thomas North, he had an amazing life, fascinating life. I won't go into all the details. Dennis McCarthy does that, and his books, and also Ed Michael Blanding, his book is a great exploration of Thomas North's life. I explored Thomas North's life from a fictional standpoint in my novel, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. He's the main character. I think he's the main person who was behind writing these plays and poetry. My take on the authorship question is very different from Dennis's, though. He's not a fan of my group theory. So, really? And so he kind of sees it as being Thomas North and Thomas North only. But for me, it only makes sense if Thomas North had help. The plays were being revised definitely up until the first folio of 1623, which is well after Thomas North's death, well after William Shakespeare's death, well after most of the other Edward de Vere's death. So I really feel strongly that the play has continued to be revised by people such as Thomas Middleton and John Webster, and Ben Jonson probably had a hand in there too. Possibly even some women were involved. Amelia Launier, I feel, had a hand involved. The biggest person, I think, was Thomas Middleton, definitely. By 1623, if you look at his other works, Women Beware Women and The Changeling, which are masterpieces of theater, he was at the height of his creative powers at that time in the early 1620s. So I think that the revising that was going on at that time.
Thomas Middleton?
Yeah.
Was that his name?
There's a great collection of his book, enormous collection of his plays that was published in the 2000s, I think 2008. I forget the editors' names, but they put it together in this massive, 2,000-page long book that explores his work.
Oof.
Yeah, that's the thing. In those times, there were so many brilliant writers. There were just so many of them.
Yeah. That's a really interesting case for questioning the Shakespeare authorship. Can you tell us a little bit about your approach? I'm curious about your title, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. How those sorts of ideas, the three big A's, anonymity, agnosticism, and I don't know what, Antichrist. How do they influence your approach to the novel? Why those three words?
Right. Well, so for Anonymous, that was how Thomas North wanted to write these works. He didn't want his name associated, and that was certainly the common practice of those times. What's important to know is that the most popular play at the time was not by Shakespeare, but was by Thomas Kyd. Thomas Kyd's play, The Spanish Tragedy, was the most popular play during the Shakespeare period, from the late 1580s until when the theaters were closed by the Puritans in 1640. It was the most popular play. Had the most editions published, so it was the most popular in terms of prints. It was the most performed play, and it never had an author's name attached to it. It never had Thomas Kyd's name attached to it. There was a reference in 1612 by a guy named Haywood, who said, "Oh yeah, Thomas Kyd, he was the writer," in a book called Apology for Actors, I believe it's called, in 1612. And Thomas Haywood, I believe Thomas was his first name. Haywood was his last name. He was the first one to give credit to Thomas Kyd. And then that wasn't even discovered until 150 years later by another author who was he's found this. It's like, wait, this guy at the time in 1612 is saying that Thomas Kyd was the writer. And by that point, Thomas Kyd had been completely forgotten. But then, so now academics, Shakespeare academics, other academics at the time have found, like, for sure, like, okay, Thomas Kidd definitely seems to be, he was the writer, so Heywood was right. But so the whole time it was anonymous. So it was a common practice. It was a common practice among all the social strata, from the elites to the working class, in terms of your association with plays especially, but even with poetry. So there was that element. And so the second element, in terms of agnosticism, I feel very strongly after studying and enjoying and loving the Shakespeare canon. Shakespeare canon is just filled with so much beautiful uncertainty. So at a time when people were really promoting certainty, whether it was the certainty of Catholicism, the old faith, or certainty the English Church, the Protestant faith, or Calvinism, or Luther, or the Puritans, everyone was all about faith. I mean, faith and certainty. And you find it, and even other things, that most of the stuff that was published in those days were like kind of like self-help books. There are a lot of like how-to books, and like very didactic, very much like telling you what to do. A lot of the poetry was very highly religious. A lot of the just like in the plays, like everything was very moralistic. And what you find, one of the things that I think why we keep coming back to the Shakespeare canon, to the plays and to the poetry, is this beautiful complexity that's there, and that you can enjoy a play like Othello, where you're the main character, the character that you're inside the head the most is this villain, Iago. And so at the same time, you have this complete like emotional connection to this romantic relationship between Othello and Desdemona. And so on the one hand, there are some clear sort of moral stances, but at the same time, there's a lot of sort of like enigmatic situations and motivations of the characters that you find from play to play. So for me, now the word agnosticism hadn't been invented yet. They did have the word atheism back then, but agnosticism, the word agnostic, didn't come until a couple of centuries later, I believe.
Yeah. I think it was sort of like during the Romance period, wasn't it? Kind of like
1800s. Yeah, I think maybe even later. Like it was quite a while later. But I really feel that the person who wrote those works, the main genius behind it, Thomas North, and a lot of his collaborators too. Certainly, I feel very strongly that Thomas Middleton and John Webster, and also Christopher Marlowe, a lot of these other collaborators he worked with were heavily influenced by his philosophical vision. And another person that's explored in the novel, to me, was his lifelong friend, the French philosopher Montaigne. So Montaigne...
Michel de Montaigne, the essayist.
Exactly. Yeah, one of my favorite philosophers. I love Montaigne, and he's a delight to read. His pieces are all short and pretty easy to sort of like consume quickly, and he has like a really great sort of like sarcastic sense of humor. Yes.
And he's tons of fun to read, and a lot of his stuff is still fairly relevant.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, and what he did was absolutely radical. It was very radical. What he did was basically deciding to write about himself. He just like admits like, okay, I'm writing about myself, and I don't really have anything like any great moral to teach you. I'm just going to investigate. I'm going to explore.
And he was sort of, isn't he kind of given credit for sort of inventing the essay also?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't believe that word had been really used before his book, the essays. Yeah. And so he really, I really feel like at this time, and a lot of people over the years have noticed a connection between Montaigne and the Shakespeare canon. Like Friedrich Nietzsche, he actually said, Nietzsche is quoted as saying that Montaigne's greatest reader was Shakespeare. And I really feel that there is definitely a connection there. The problem is that there wasn't an English translation of Montaigne's essays until John Florio did it in the early 1600s. I think it was like 1603, sometime around that, 1602, 1603.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to basically have read those works in the original French to have any kind of an influence on the plays. Like most of the works had been written by that point. So I feel like that there was, to me, my perspective on it was that Thomas North and Montaigne were lifelong friends, and that they had a correspondence, and that they actually influenced each other. And that's one of the things that I explore in the novel, was their relationship. And so you have basically these I think very deeply thoughtful men, Montaigne and Thomas North, who were very different in many ways, but also their similarity was that they both were very much attached to the idea of exploring what it means to be human without really any preconceived notions, or without like an end game to prove a point. So, and this is where Harold Bloom, the Shakespeare scholar, he wrote a book called The Invention of the Human about Shakespeare, and he argues, he takes some examples from the plays as to why this is so, that really for the first time you have human beings taking center stage. Before there was really hard to argue that there had been something like that to that extent, where human beings were the main point of interest and what we wanted to look at and analyze and explore and love and hate, and just like being able to do that, I think was enormously radical. So I really feel like what I wanted to do with the novel was explore that aspect of it, that sort of agnosticism. It's a very passionate agnosticism, but it's definitely filled with a lot of doubt. And I think the most famous passage in all of the Shakespeare canon, "To be or not to be," is one of the greatest expressions of agnosticism. And it doesn't provide you with a solution. It just questioning. It's just questioning, and done like in so beautifully a way, because we know when you watch the play or read the play, what follows him talking about whether he's going to kill himself or not, is that he's confronted with his lover, with Ophelia, who is playing is being basically forced by her father to play this kind of like game with him. So it was, I mean, which is absolutely brilliant to have the scene where he talks about to be or not to be, followed by this scene where he's confronted by his woman he's in love with, and who she's in love with him, but she's forced by her father to play these social political games with him, just like emphasizes that speech even more so. And I think that's where the speeches are great in and of themselves, but when you put them in context of the story, they're even heightened even more so. So that's the agnosticism part. And then lastly, the Antichrist.
The Antichrist.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I definitely feel that Thomas North was very much saw himself in this fashion.
In what fashion? Can you explain sort of like the context of what Antichrist would have meant?
Sure.
Then?
So back in those days, if you look at in terms of how it was used back then, it was used for one's enemy. So if you were an English Protestant, then you would call the Pope the Antichrist. If you were an Italian Catholic, then you would call Queen Elizabeth the Antichrist. So it was used for anyone who you basically didn't agree with in that sense. But what I explore in the novel was that Thomas North, there's a scene between him and one of his collaborators, Thomas Watson, who was a poet in the 1580s, who says, well, if you actually look at it in the Bible, I think it's in the Gospel according to John, the word Antichrist is just made reference to anyone who's not a Christian. And so Thomas North argues with Watson and tells him that basically, if you're not a Christian, you are an Antichrist. And for him, he is not a Christian. And I think his Antichrist situation really ties into what I was talking about before in terms of the humanist aspect. It's not the classical humanist that you find in Rome, which was still Christian. Here was where you're not sublimating the human for the divine. The divine is not dominating the human. The human is dominating the stories and dominating the thoughts and dominating the situation. And it's true. It's from sonnet after sonnet, it's all about the human angst, human love, human heartache, the joy, the beautiful aspect of being in love, the pain. Then if you look at the two narrative sonnets, Venus and Adonis, Venus, the goddess of love, who's madly in love with this youth who doesn't want to have anything to do with her. And then you have The Rape of Lucrece, which is about Tarquin and his rape of this virgin, which happens to be, she's the wife of one of his best friends. Just a good play after play. And then if you put it in the context of the times, just so much was about religion. Like everyone's lives was about religion. Everything was about religion. Politics was about, everything was about religion. And here you come to these plays, and really, like, the supernatural is definitely involved. Like he's in Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, but it's very mysterious and it's not explained.
Heck, Hamlet.
In Hamlet,
yeah.
right? In his father's ghost. A lot of times it's just not explained. It's not really, it's meant to be there. It's this imposing force for sure, the supernatural, but it's never explained. And this is in stark contrast to a lot of the plays of the time, a lot of the poetry of the time, which was heavily religious in nature. So I really felt that, and this is not even talking about what probably Thomas North's bisexuality in the sonnets, declaring his love for another man. And it's like, he doesn't see it as inherently wrong or sinful that he's in love with another man. Like, it's just that he talks about all his other painful experiences, but there's never any mention in the sonnets that, like, oh, well, the fact that I'm in love with this other man is wrong and is a sin. So I think to get inside the mental state of the creator, you had to see this. For me, it made sense that this person was definitely not a Christian.
That's interesting. I kind of want to read that now too. All right. Well, you've given me some stuff to read over this summer.
Okay. Awesome.
Do you feel like you are done working on the question of Shakespeare authorship? Like you said, this has been sort of the culmination of like 30 years of work. Is there more left for you to explore?
I almost wanted to. I was actually in the middle of writing another novel that was going to take a different perspective. It was going to basically put forth that Francis Bacon's older brother, Anthony Bacon, was the true author. And just sort of, and just sort of focused on his. So I wanted it to be kind of like a Rashomon kind of thing, where the Japanese movie by Akira Kurosawa, where there's like these like four different versions of what happened in this forest between a man, his wife, and this bandit and this witness, and they all have four different versions of the same thing. So I kind of wanted it to be like to leave the version where it's Thomas North and his collaborators, and then also have an alternative version of the story. So I actually got quite involved in that, but I just decided to just put it away. It's just one of the many projects that I've worked on over the years where I just felt it wasn't right, and I just felt like it was time to move on and just let Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists and Passionate Pilgrims be what I wanted to say about the Shakespeare authorship question, and just leave it at that.
In all honesty, it sounds like the human drama is going to keep you a little busy for a while.
Hopefully I live long enough to finish it. Yeah, because it's a daunting task.
Yeah,
for sure. It was hard for me to say goodbye to the Shakespeare story. Probably out of everything I've written, writing Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist was probably the most enjoyable thing I've ever written. I really felt I was there, and I'm so in love with the times that I got really emotionally invested in that, and I rewrote it just over and over again. And so I almost didn't want to. I just wanted to keep rewriting it just so that way I could just stay involved with it. But I had to let it go. So it was a hard letting go. But I have to move on and just focus on this next project. But I'm very happy with Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist. Passionate Pilgrims as a good companion piece to it. So it's basically what I want to say about it, and I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, it sounds really fascinating. I've always enjoyed kind of the Shakespeare authorship question, but I've never spent a whole lot of time on it. But like the way that you approached it sounded rational and like something that's kind of like worth investigating. So thank you very much for that. Can you tell the listeners where to find your work online? Like where can they go to find your books and all of your stuff?
Sure. So everything I wrote is on Amazon, but the best place to go for everything that I've done is to go to my website. So it's love-chaos.com. So it's LOVE-CHAOS.com. Now everything, all the links to all the books.
That's a great domain name.
Yeah, Love Chaos without the dash was already taken, so I had to had the dash in there. So, But yeah, that everything I've ever done is on there, including my dad's play. My dad wrote a play 20 years ago, which I love, is on there. And all the interviews like I did years ago. I've done like, I don't know, 40 interviews over the years. And so it's talking about Love, Chaos, and the other books I've written about Faust and the Divine Comedy book, Parzival, and other books, other novels, or everything's on there. So if you're just curious, but highly recommend going on there and just checking it out.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest. I look forward to checking out more of your work and seeing where the human drama takes you next.
Absolutely. I'm excited. Thank you so much for having me on here. This was a blast talking. I love talking about Shakespeare and talking about these things. Thank you so much for your intelligence and your curiosity. Much appreciated.
This has been another episode of the Arnemancy Podcast. Thank you for joining me. I have been your host, Reverend Eric. You can find Arnemancy online at arnemancy.com, and you can subscribe to this podcast anywhere podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting the Arnemancy Project for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy.
This is Vanessa Irena, and I'm really excited to announce my new store, Sword and Scythe, where I will be offering magical art, materia, and services beneath Mars and Saturn. You can visit the store at swordandscythe.com and be sure to sign up for the email list to receive early access to new releases.